Marcus stood at attention outside Buckingham Palace, his red tunic pressed to perfection and his bearskin hat sitting precisely on his head. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard as tourists snapped photos and whispered about the stoic guards who never moved, never smiled, never showed any emotion. What they didn't know was that behind those steady brown eyes was a man who had seen more action than most soldiers would in 10 lifetimes. At 42, Marcus had been a royal guard for only 8 months. Before that, he had spent 18 years in the Special Air Service, the elite SAS regiment that handled the most dangerous missions the British military could offer. He had served in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and half a dozen other countries that never made it into the newspapers. His hands had held weapons worth more than most people's cars, and his aim was legendary among those who knew him in his previous life. But nobody at the palace knew any of this. When Marcus applied for the position, his military record showed only his basic service information. The classified details of his SAS career were buried so deep that even the palace's security clearance couldn't access them. To his new colleagues, he was just another ex-soldier looking for steady work and a decent pension. The other guards treated him politely enough, but there was always an undercurrent of doubt. Some whispered that he was too old to be starting as a new guard. Others questioned whether he had what it took to handle the pressure of protecting the royal family. Marcus said nothing. He had learned long ago that actions spoke louder than words, and he was content to let his work prove his worth. During his breaks, Marcus would often overhear conversations about weekend shooting competitions and military exercises. The younger guards loved to talk about their marksmanship scores and compare their performance at the local firing ranges. They spoke with the confidence of men who had completed their basic training and felt proud of their abilities. Marcus listened quietly, sometimes allowing himself a small smile at their enthusiasm. "Did you hear about the new scoring system at Bisley?" asked James, a 26-year-old guard who had joined 2 years earlier. He was addressing a small group during their lunch break in the guards' common room. "They've made it even more challenging. I managed a decent score last weekend, but some of the veterans there were incredible." "What kind of scores are we talking about?" asked David, another young guard who had been bragging about his shooting skills for weeks. "Well, I hit 38 out of 50 at 300 meters, James replied with obvious pride. The range officer said it was quite good for someone my age. The others nodded approvingly, and the conversation continued, with each guard sharing their best shooting stories. Marcus sat in the corner, eating his sandwich and reading a newspaper, but his ears picked up every word. 38 out of 50, at 300 meters. He remembered when that would have been considered a warm-up exercise. As the weeks passed, the talk about shooting became more frequent. There was going to be an inter-service competition in 2 months, and several of the guards were planning to participate. The prizes were modest, but the bragging rights would last for months. More importantly, the competition would be attended by senior officers and palace officials. A good showing could lead to promotions and better assignments. "Marcus, you should join us," suggested James one afternoon. "You're ex-military, right? You must know your way around a rifle." Marcus looked up from the equipment he was cleaning. "I did some shooting in the Army," he replied simply. "What unit were you with?" asked David, trying to sound casual but clearly fishing for information. "Just regular infantry," Marcus answered, which was technically true, though it left out 18 years of specialized training that most soldiers never even heard about. David nodded, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Well, you should come out with us this weekend. We're going to the range in Surrey. Nothing too serious, just some practice before the big competition." Marcus considered the invitation. He had been keeping a low profile since joining the guards. But perhaps it was time to show a little of what he could do. Not everything, of course. That would raise too many questions, but enough to earn some respect from his colleagues. "All right," he said finally. "I'll come along." The announcement created a small buzz among the group. Word spread quickly through the guards' quarters that the quiet new guy was finally going to show what he could do with a rifle. Some were genuinely curious about his abilities, while others seemed eager to see him fail. There had been whispers that Marcus was hiding something about his past, and a few of the guards resented his calm confidence. "I bet he's all talk," muttered Simon, a guard who had never liked Marcus's quiet demeanor. "These older guys always claim they were better back in their day, but when it comes time to prove it, they fall apart." "We'll see," replied James, though his tone suggested he was beginning to have his own doubts about their newest colleague. As the weekend approached, Marcus found himself thinking about the upcoming range session more than he expected. It had been almost a year since he had fired a weapon in anger, and even longer since he had done any recreational shooting. His muscle memory was still there, he was sure of that. But would his reflexes be as sharp as they once were? The night before the range day, Marcus lay in his small apartment near the barracks and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow would be interesting, he thought. His new colleagues had no idea what they were about to witness. The question was how much. Of his true ability he should reveal. Too little, and they would continue to doubt him. Too much, and they would start asking questions he couldn't answer. He closed his eyes and let his mind drift back to the mountains of Afghanistan, where a single missed shot could mean the difference between life and death for his entire team. Those days seemed like a lifetime ago, but the skills remained, buried just beneath the surface of his quiet exterior. Tomorrow, perhaps, it would be time to remind himself just how good he had once been. Saturday morning arrived with a crisp autumn chill, and Marcus found himself riding in the back of a van with 6 other guards heading to the Surrey Shooting Club. The conversation was lively, filled with boasts about past performances and predictions, about who would shoot best that day. Marcus sat quietly, watching the countryside roll past the windows, but his silence only seemed to make the others more talkative. "So, Marcus," said David, turning around from the front seat, "what's the best? Score you ever shot in the Army?" Marcus thought carefully before answering. "I don't really keep track of numbers," he said. "It was more about getting the job done." This response drew some chuckles from the group. "Come on, mate," pressed Simon, who was driving. "Everyone remembers. Their best score. I shot 42 out of 50 last month, and I'll remember that forever. Different ranges have different standards," Marcus replied diplomatically. "Hard to compare them all." The conversation moved on to other topics, but Marcus could sense the skepticism in their voices. They were starting to think he was just another aging soldier trying to live off past glory that might not have existed at all. He didn't blame them for their doubts. In their position, he might have thought the same thing. The Surrey Shooting Club was a well-maintained facility with multiple ranges for different types of firearms. As they walked through the entrance, Marcus noticed the familiar smell of gun oil and the distant sound of rifle reports. It brought back memories, some good and some he preferred not to think about too much. "Right then," announced James, who seemed to have appointed himself as the group's leader for the day. "We've got the range booked for 3 hours. I suggest we start at 200 meters and work our way back to 500. That should give everyone a good workout." The others nodded enthusiastically, but Marcus raised an eyebrow. 500 meters was quite a distance for recreational shooting, especially with the standard L85A2 rifles they would be using. Most weekend warriors never attempted shots beyond 300 meters, and many struggled even at that range. They checked in with the range officer, a gruff ex-sergeant named Thompson who looked like he had seen it all. He glanced at their group with the weary expression of a man who spent his weekends watching amateur shooters waste ammunition. "You boys know the rules," Thompson said as he handed out eye and ear protection. "Keep your weapons pointed downrange at all times. No rapid fire unless specifically authorized. And for God's sake, wait for the all-clear before you go downrange to check your targets." The guards nodded and began setting up their equipment. Marcus noticed that most of them had brought their own rifles, expensive civilian models with high-end scopes and custom stocks. He had signed out a standard military rifle from the armory, the same type he had carried during his early years in the regular army. "You sure that old thing will be accurate enough?" asked David, eyeing Marcus's rifle with undisguised disdain. "These competitions can be won or lost by millimeters." "It should be fine," Marcus replied, running his hands over the familiar weapon. The rifle was well maintained, and he could tell it had been properly zeroed. More importantly, it was exactly the type of weapon he had learned to shoot with decades ago. Sometimes, familiarity was more valuable than fancy equipment. They started at the 200-meter line, firing 10 rounds each at standard military targets. The other guards shot first, and Marcus was impressed with their accuracy. James managed 8 hits in the center ring, while David scored 7. Even Simon, who talked the most but seemed the least confident, managed 6 solid hits. When it was Marcus's turn, he took his time settling into position. He adjusted the sling, found his natural point of aim, and controlled his breathing exactly, as he had been taught 30 years ago. The routine was so automatic that he didn't even think about it consciously. The first shot surprised him with its recoil. It had been longer than he thought since he had fired a rifle, and his body had forgotten the physical sensation. But his mind remembered everything else. The sight picture was perfect, the trigger pull was smooth, and he knew before the bullet reached the target that it was a good shot. 10 rounds later, Marcus lowered his rifle and waited for the ceasefire. Command. When they went forward to check targets, he saw that he had put all 10 shots into a group smaller than his fist, with 9 of them in the center ring. It was solid shooting, but nothing spectacular. "Not bad for an old-timer," commented David, though his tone suggested he was slightly disappointed that Marcus hadn't embarrassed himself. They moved back to 300 meters, and the pattern repeated itself. The younger guards shot well, but Marcus shot slightly better, grouping his shots with mechanical precision. Still, his performance was good, but not outstanding. Anyone could have a lucky day at 300 meters. It was at 400 meters that things began to change. The wind had picked up, making the shots more challenging, and the target seemed impossibly small through the standard iron sights. James managed only 4 hits out of 10, and David did even worse. Simon, who had been struggling all morning, managed just 2 hits in the target area. Marcus took his position and immediately felt the difference. This was the range where natural ability separated itself from mere training. He could feel the wind on his face and see how it was affecting the grass between the firing line and the targets. His experience told him exactly how to compensate for the conditions. His first shot hit dead center, and he knew he was back in his element. The second shot followed the first, then the third and fourth. By the time he finished his string, Marcus had put 9 shots into the center ring and 1 just outside it. The group was so tight that Thompson had to use a magnifying glass to count the holes. "Bloody hell," muttered James, staring at the target in disbelief. "How did you do that?" Marcus shrugged. "Good day, I suppose." But the others weren't buying it anymore. They had seen enough military shooting to know the difference between luck and skill, and what Marcus had just demonstrated was pure skill. The whispered conversation started immediately, and he could see the questions forming in their eyes. "Maybe we should try 500 meters, suggested Simon, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. See if that was just a fluke. Marcus nodded calmly, but inside he was beginning to enjoy himself. It had been a long time since he had been able to show off his abilities, even in such a limited way. 500 meters would be interesting indeed. The 500-meter line was where most amateur shooters discovered their limitations. The targets looked like postage stamps in the distance, and even experienced marksmen often struggled to hit them consistently. Thompson, the range officer, watched with interest as the group prepared for what he privately considered the real test. "This is where it gets tricky, lads," Thompson announced. "At this distance, everything matters. Wind, temperature, even the humidity can affect your shots. Take your time and don't get discouraged if you miss a few." The younger guards approached the firing line with noticeably less confidence than they had shown earlier. James went first, taking nearly a minute to line up each shot. His first 3 rounds missed the target entirely, sailing off into the backstop somewhere to the left. His 4th shot clipped the bottom edge, and his 5th was a clean miss again. By the time he finished his 10-round string, he had managed only 3 hits on target, and none of them were anywhere near the center. David didn't fare much better. He was clearly frustrated by the distance and began rushing his shots, which only made things worse. 7 of his 10 rounds missed completely, and the 3 that found the target were scattered across its face without any apparent pattern. Simon wisely decided not to embarrass himself further and announced that his shoulder was bothering him from the earlier shooting. Everyone understood this was just an excuse, but they let it pass without comment. As Marcus stepped up to the firing line, he could feel the eyes of his colleagues watching him intently. The earlier doubt had been replaced by genuine curiosity. His performance at 400 meters had been too good to ignore, and now they wanted to see if he could maintain that level of accuracy at the ultimate distance. Marcus settled into his prone position and immediately began reading the conditions. The wind was gusty, coming from his left at about 8 miles per hour with occasional stronger puffs. The temperature had risen slightly since morning, which would affect the bullet's trajectory. Most importantly, the mirage was dancing across the range, creating optical illusions that could throw off even experienced shooters. But these were all factors that Marcus had dealt with thousands of times before. During his SAS years, he had regularly made shots at distances far greater than 500 meters, often under conditions that would have made today's weather seem pleasant by comparison. He had shot in desert heat that made the air shimmer like water, and in mountain cold that froze his trigger finger despite his gloves. His first shot felt perfect the moment he pulled the trigger. The rifle recoiled straight back into his shoulder, and he maintained his sight picture long enough to call the shot before it hit. Through the scope, he saw a small puff of dust kick up directly behind the target, indicating a center hit. Center. X, called Thompson, his voice carrying a note of surprise. The center X was the smallest ring on the target, worth maximum points in competition shooting. Marcus worked the bolt smoothly and prepared for his second shot. The wind had shifted slightly, so he adjusted his aim point accordingly. Another perfect shot, another center hit. By his 5th shot, a small crowd had gathered behind the firing line, including several other club members who had heard about the unusual accuracy being displayed. "Who is this guy?" whispered one of the onlookers. "To Thompson. Says he's regular Army," Thompson replied quietly. "But I've been doing this for 20 years, and regular Army doesn't shoot like that." Marcus was vaguely aware of the growing attention, but his focus was entirely on the target downrange. Each shot required complete concentration, and he fell back into the meditative rhythm that had served him so well in combat situations. Breathe, aim, squeeze, follow through. The routine was as natural to him as walking. His 6th shot opened up the group slightly, landing just outside the center ring, but still well within the scoring area. It was the first shot all day that wasn't perfect, and Marcus found himself analyzing what had gone wrong. The wind had gusted just as he fired, but he should have anticipated that based on the movement of the grass. The 7th shot brought him back to center, and the 8th followed it precisely. For his 9th shot, Marcus decided to demonstrate something that few recreational shooters ever attempted. Instead of aiming for the safest part of the target, he aimed for the tiny center dot that marked the exact middle of the scoring rings. The shot broke cleanly, and through the scope, Marcus saw the bullet hole appear directly on top of the aiming point. It was the kind of shot that required not just skill, but a perfect understanding of the rifle, the ammunition, and the conditions. For his final shot, Marcus allowed himself a moment to appreciate the situation. Here he was, supposedly just another aging ex-soldier, about to put an exclamation point on a performance that would have impressed his old SAS instructors. He settled into the familiar position one last time and sent the 10th round downrange with quiet confidence. When the ceasefire was called and they walked forward to examine the targets, the silence was deafening. Marcus had put all 10 shots, into a group that could be covered by a teacup, with 8 of them in the center scoring ring. It was shooting that belonged in a competition manual, not on a casual weekend outing. "Jesus Christ," breathed James, staring at the target in amazement. "I've never seen anything like this." Thompson examined the target carefully, measuring the group size and counting the scoring rings. "This is professional-level shooting," he announced finally. "I mean Olympic-level stuff. Where exactly did you serve, son?" Marcus kept his expression neutral. "Here and there," he replied. "Different places over the years." But the casual deflection wasn't working anymore. David was studying him with obvious suspicion, and even Simon had abandoned his pretense of a sore shoulder to examine the impossible target. "Come on, Marcus," pressed James. "You don't just shoot like this without serious training. What unit were you really with?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the rifle barrels. Marcus realized that his cover story was beginning to fall apart, but he wasn't ready to reveal the full truth. Not yet, anyway. "Special Forces," he said finally, keeping his voice matter-of-fact. But that was a long time ago. The admission sent a ripple of excitement through the group, but it also raised even more questions. Which Special Forces unit? What kind of operations? How classified was his service record? Thompson nodded knowingly. "That explains it," he said. "I knew that wasn't regular Army shooting. You boys just got schooled by a professional." As they packed up their equipment and prepared to leave, Marcus could see that everything had changed. The other guards looked at him with new respect, but also with wariness. He was no longer just the quiet new guy who kept to himself. He was something else entirely, something that made them realize how little they actually knew about their colleague. The ride back to London was much quieter than the trip out, and Marcus spent most of it wondering whether he had made a mistake by revealing even that much of his background. Word of Marcus's shooting performance spread through the palace guard quarters like wildfire. By Monday morning, everyone seemed to know that the quiet new guard had embarrassed the younger men at the shooting range with displays of marksmanship that bordered on the impossible. The story grew with each telling, and by the time it reached the senior officers, Marcus had supposedly hit targets that weren't even visible to the naked eye. Captain Reynolds, the officer in charge of the palace. "Guard!" called Marcus into his office on Tuesday afternoon. Reynolds was a career military man who had earned his commission through hard work and political savvy rather than combat experience. He had always been slightly uncomfortable around the more experienced enlisted men, particularly those with combat records that exceeded his own. "Sit down, Marcus," Reynolds said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. "I've been hearing interesting stories about your weekend activities." Marcus took the offered seat and maintained his usual neutral expression. "Just some recreational shooting, sir. Nothing special." Reynolds consulted a file on his desk, presumably Marcus's personnel record. "Your file says you served with the 2nd Battalion, Parachute Regiment, standard infantry training, basic marksmanship certification, nothing that would suggest the kind of performance I'm hearing about." "I always enjoyed shooting, sir," Marcus replied carefully. "Had some good instructors over the years." The captain studied him for a long moment. "Marcus, I'm going to be direct with you. Your shooting performance this weekend has raised some questions. Questions that I need answered if you're going to continue serving in a position that requires the highest security clearance." Marcus had been expecting this conversation, but it still made him uncomfortable. His SAS service was classified at a level that even Reynolds couldn't access. But the captain clearly suspected there was more to the story than Marcus had revealed. "I understand your concerns, sir," Marcus said. "What exactly would you like to know?" "I'd like to know why a supposedly basic infantry soldier can outshoot men who've been training for years. I'd like to know why Thompson at the Surrey Club says your technique looks like something he's only seen from Olympic competitors. And most of all, I'd like to know what else you haven't told us about your background." Marcus weighed his options carefully. He could continue the deception, but that would only make things worse in the long run. He could tell the complete truth, but that would violate security protocols that he had sworn to uphold. Or he could find a middle ground that satisfied Reynolds without compromising classified information. "Sir, some of my service record is classified above your clearance level," he said finally. "I can tell you that I did serve with special units and that I received advanced marksmanship training. But the specific details of my assignments and operations aren't something I can discuss." Reynolds leaned back in his chair, clearly frustrated. "This puts me in a difficult position, Marcus. I have a guard whose background I can't fully verify, who possesses skills that far exceed what his official record suggests. How am I supposed to explain that to my superiors? With respect, sir, my shooting ability doesn't affect my capacity to perform my duties as a royal guard. If anything, it makes me more qualified to protect the royal family." "That's not the point," Reynolds snapped. "The point is trust. How can I trust someone who isn't being completely honest about his past?" Before Marcus could respond, there was a knock on the office door. Reynolds called for whoever it was to enter, and Sergeant Major Collins stepped into the room. Collins was a veteran of 30 years' service who had seen combat in the Falklands, Northern Ireland, and the Gulf War. He was respected by everyone in the regiment and feared by anyone who tried to cut corners or bend the rules. "Sir, I apologize for interrupting," Collins said, "but I thought you should know that there's been a development regarding Marcus's background check." Reynolds gestured for Collins to continue. "I've just received a call from the Ministry of Defense. Personnel Security Unit. It seems that someone has been making inquiries about Marcus's service record. Official inquiries, sir, from people with very high clearance levels." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. If the MOD was getting involved, it meant that someone had noticed the discrepancies in his cover story and was beginning to dig deeper. "What kind of inquiries?" Reynolds asked. "They wouldn't say, sir, but they did confirm that Marcus's complete service record is classified well above our level. They also said that any further questions about his background should be directed through official channels, not through informal conversations." Reynolds looked from Collins to Marcus and back again. "Are you telling me that we have a guard whose background is so classified that I can't even verify his identity?" "What I'm telling you, sir," Collins replied, "is that Marcus has been cleared for duty by people who outrank all of us combined. If they're satisfied with his background, then perhaps we should be as well." There was a long silence in the office. Marcus could see Reynolds struggling with the situation, caught between his desire to maintain control over his command and his awareness that he was dealing with forces beyond his authority. "Very well," Reynolds said finally. "But I want it understood that any future incidents or questions about your background will be dealt with through official channels. No more surprises, Marcus." "Understood, sir," Marcus replied. As they left Reynolds' office, Collins walked alongside Marcus down the corridor. "That was interesting," the sergeant major said quietly. "Haven't seen the MOD move that fast on a personnel issue in years." Marcus said nothing, but Collins continued talking. "Anyway, you know, I served with some special forces lads over the years. Good soldiers, all of them. But they carried themselves differently. More confident, maybe. More aware of their surroundings." He paused and glanced at Marcus. "You remind me of those men." "Thank you, Sergeant Major," Marcus replied diplomatically. "The thing is," Collins continued, "those men usually had stories they couldn't tell. Places they'd been, things they'd done, people they'd met. All classified, all buried in files that most of us will never see." They had reached the entrance to the guard quarters, and Collins stopped walking. "I don't know what your story is, Marcus, and I don't need to know. But I want you to understand that you have my support. Men like you don't end up guarding the palace by accident. Someone very important thinks you belong here, and that's good enough for me." Marcus nodded his appreciation. But as he entered the quarters, he couldn't shake the feeling that his carefully constructed new life was beginning to unravel. The shooting demonstration had been a mistake, he realized. He had let his ego override his judgment, and now he was paying the price. But there was no going back now. The questions had been asked, the inquiries had been made, and his cover story was no longer sufficient. Soon he would have to decide how much of the truth he was willing to reveal, and how much he was prepared to keep hidden forever. 3 weeks after the shooting range incident, Marcus was performing his usual duties outside Buckingham Palace when he noticed increased activity among the senior security staff. Radio chatter was more frequent than usual, and several men in expensive suits had been having hushed conversations near the main entrance. Something was happening, but as a regular guard, he wasn't privy to the details. That evening, Sergeant Major Collins approached him with unusual formality. "Marcus, you're wanted in the briefing room at 800 hours tomorrow. Full dress uniform, and bring your service record file." "What's this about, Sergeant Major?" Marcus asked. "Above my pay grade, I'm afraid. But there will be some important people there. So make sure you're prepared for anything." Marcus spent most of that night wondering what kind of trouble he had gotten himself into. The mysterious phone calls to the Ministry of Defense, the questions about his background, and now a formal briefing with unidentified important people. It felt like his past was finally catching up with him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He arrived at the briefing room precisely at 8 o'clock, wearing his best uniform and carrying the thin file that contained his official service record. To his surprise, the room contained not just Captain Reynolds and Sergeant Major Collins, but also 3 civilians he didn't recognize and a man in colonel's insignia who clearly wasn't part of the palace guard. "Marcus, please take a seat," said one of the civilians, a distinguished-looking woman in her 50s. "I'm Sarah Henderson from the Cabinet Office. This is Colonel Morrison from Special Forces Command, and these gentlemen are from the Metropolitan Police Counter-Terrorism Unit." Marcus sat down, his mind racing. This wasn't just about his shooting performance anymore. This was something much bigger and potentially much more dangerous. "Marcus," Henderson continued, "we need to discuss your background, specifically your service with the 22nd Special Air Service Regiment." The revelation hit the room like a bombshell. Captain Reynolds went pale, and even Sergeant Major Collins looked surprised. Marcus had never mentioned the SAS by name, and his official records made no reference to his elite service. "Ma'am, I'm not sure what you mean," Marcus began, but Colonel Morrison cut him off. "Marcus, we know exactly who you are and what you've done. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, 18 years with the regiment, 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq. Classified operations in Syria, Libya, and half a dozen other places. Silver Star, Distinguished Conduct Medal, and commendations from allies in 4 different countries." Marcus realized that any pretense was now pointless. These people had access to his complete file, including details that he thought were buried forever. "Yes, sir," he said simply. "That's correct." Henderson leaned forward. "The question is why. You're here, working as a palace guard under a false service record, when you could be earning 10 times as much as a private military contractor." Marcus thought carefully before answering. "I wanted a quiet life, ma'am. After 18 years of combat operations, I was tired of violence. The palace guard seemed like honorable work that would let me serve my country without having to kill anyone." "That's admirable," said one of the counter-terrorism officers. "But it also presents us with an opportunity." He slid a folder across the table to Marcus. Inside were photographs of several men, along with detailed intelligence reports and surveillance notes. "We have a situation developing," the officer continued. "Intelligence suggests that a terrorist cell is planning an attack during the Queen's upcoming state visit to Scotland. Traditional security measures may not be sufficient, and we need someone with your particular skills to help us prevent it." Marcus studied the photographs. The men looked like typical extremists, but he could see from their body language and positioning that they were more sophisticated than the usual amateur terrorists who made headlines. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" he said. Colonel Morrison answered. "We want you to continue your duties as a palace guard, but also serve as an undercover asset for the counterterrorism team. Your position gives you access to areas and information that would be impossible for other operatives to obtain. And if I refuse?" Then you continue your normal duties, and we handle the situation through other means, Henderson replied. But, Marcus, these men are professionals. They've been planning this operation for months, and they have inside knowledge of palace security procedures. We need someone equally professional to stop them. Marcus looked around the room at the faces, watching him. Captain Reynolds still looked stunned by the revelations about his background, but Sergeant Major Collins was nodding slightly, as if everything finally made sense to him. What's the timeline? Marcus asked. 2 weeks, said the counterterrorism officer. The state visit begins in 14 days, and intelligence suggests they'll make their move during the public ceremony at Edinburgh Castle. Marcus closed the folder and handed it back. I'll need full operational briefings, communication protocols, and backup support. And I want to choose my own equipment. Of course, Morrison replied. You'll have everything you need. Henderson stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. Marcus, I want you to understand that this operation is classified at the highest level. Even your fellow guards cannot know about your real role. As far as everyone else is concerned, you're still just Marcus the Quiet Palace Guard. As the others filed out of the room, Sergeant Major Collins lingered behind. I knew there was something different about you, he said quietly. The way you moved, the way you watched everything. I've seen enough Special Forces soldiers to recognize the signs. I'm sorry for the deception, Sergeant Major, Marcus replied. Don't be. Men like you do what's necessary to keep the rest of us safe. I respect that, even if I don't always understand it. Collins moved toward the door, then turned back. Marcus, whatever happens in the next 2 weeks, remember that you have friends here. People who will support you even if they don't know the whole story. After Collins left, Marcus sat alone in the empty briefing room, thinking about the path his life had taken. 6 months ago, he had been a burned-out Special Forces veteran looking for peace and quiet. Now he was about to undertake what might be the most important mission of his career, using skills he had hoped never to need again. But as he thought about the threat to the Queen and the innocent people who might be hurt in an attack, Marcus felt the familiar surge of purpose that had sustained him through 18 years of dangerous operations. Some jobs were too important to leave to others, and protecting the crown was definitely one of them. He stood up, straightened his uniform, and walked out to begin preparations for what would either be his greatest success or his final mission. The morning of the Queen's state visit to Edinburgh Castle dawned gray and misty, with low clouds hanging over the ancient fortress like a protective shroud. Marcus stood at his assigned position near the castle's main entrance, wearing his ceremonial red tunic and bearskin hat. But underneath his traditional uniform was state-of-the-art communication equipment and body armor that would have impressed his old SAS colleagues. 2 weeks of intensive preparation had led to this moment. Marcus had studied every inch of the castle grounds, memorized the faces of known terrorists, and coordinated with counter-terrorism teams positioned throughout Edinburgh. The intelligence reports suggested that the attack would come during the public ceremony in the castle's Crown Square, where the Queen would address several hundred invited guests and dignitaries. The terrorists had been identified as a sophisticated cell with connections to international extremist networks. Their leader, a man named Hassan al-Rashid, had previously been involved in attacks across Europe and was considered extremely dangerous. Intelligence suggested they had been planning this operation for over a year, with inside knowledge of security, procedures that made them far more threatening than typical amateur terrorists. As the morning progressed, Marcus watched the steady stream of guests arriving for the ceremony. His trained eye automatically scanned each face, looking for anything unusual or suspicious. The counterterrorism team had briefed him on 12 potential threats, but he knew that the real danger might come from someone they hadn't identified yet. At 11:30, his earpiece crackled with a coded message from the surveillance team. Falcon, this is Eagle Eye. We have possible movement on Target 3, Blue van approaching north entrance, 2 occupants matching suspect profiles. Marcus acknowledged the message with a subtle touch to his collar and shifted his position slightly to get a better view of the north entrance. Through his peripheral vision, he could see the blue van mentioned in the report, but from his current angle, he couldn't identify the occupants. "Eagle Eye, Falcon needs visual confirmation on occupants," he whispered into his concealed microphone. "Stand by, Falcon. Zooming in now." The seconds stretched like hours as Marcus waited for confirmation. Around him, tourists and dignitaries continued their normal activities, completely unaware of the potential danger developing just meters away. He had to admire the professionalism of the terrorist cell. Their timing and positioning showed careful planning and excellent operational. "Security, Falcon," confirmed match on both occupants. "Al-Rashid is in the passenger seat. Armed companion in driver position. They're moving toward your location." Marcus felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that had sustained him through countless dangerous operations. After months of quiet palace duty, he was back in his element, where split-second decisions could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. The blue van pulled into a parking area about 50 meters from Marcus's position. Both men got out, and Marcus immediately recognized Al-Rashid from the intelligence photographs. The terrorist leader was dressed as a maintenance worker, carrying what appeared to be a toolbox, but moving with the confident stride of a man on a mission. "Eagle Eye, targets are mobile and approaching the main entrance, requesting permission to intercept." "Negative, Falcon. Let them get closer to confirm their intentions. We need to catch them in the act to ensure prosecution." Marcus gritted his teeth but acknowledged the order. He understood the legal requirements, but his instincts told him that waiting was dangerous. These men hadn't come this far just to turn around at the last minute. Al-Rashid and his companion approached the security checkpoint, presenting what appeared to be legitimate maintenance credentials. Marcus watched as the guards examined their paperwork and waved them through. Whatever documents they were using, they were good enough to fool the initial screening. As the terrorists moved deeper into the castle grounds, Marcus received new instructions. "Falcon, you're cleared to follow at a distance. Maintain visual contact, but do not engage unless they present an immediate threat." Marcus began moving through the crowd, using his knowledge of the castle layout to stay close to the targets without being obvious. His years of surveillance training served him well as he navigated between tourists and security personnel, always keeping Al-Rashid in sight. The terrorists made their way toward Crown Square, where the ceremony was scheduled to begin in 20 minutes. Marcus could see the Queen's security detail making final preparations, completely unaware of the danger approaching from within their own perimeter. "Eagle Eye, targets are heading toward Crown Square. They're carrying what appears to be maintenance equipment, but I can see suspicious bulges in their clothing consistent with explosive devices." "Understood, Falcon. Counter-terrorism teams are moving to intercept positions. Maintain surveillance and be ready to engage on my command." As they reached the edge of Crown Square, Al-Rashid stopped and surveyed the area with the practiced eye of a professional soldier. Marcus could see him counting security positions and noting escape routes. Whatever they were planning, it was about to happen. Suddenly, Al-Rashid's companion opened his toolbox and began assembling what was clearly an explosive device. The operation was moving faster than anyone had anticipated, and Marcus realized that waiting for backup might not be an option. "Eagle Eye, target is arming an explosive device. I have a clear shot and recommend immediate engagement. Falcon, hold your position. Teams are 30 seconds out, but 30 seconds might be too long." Marcus could see that the device was nearly ready, and Al-Rashid was moving toward a position that would give him clear sight lines to the royal party. The Queen herself would be arriving any moment, and hundreds of innocent people were already gathered in the target area. Marcus made the decision that his training and experience had prepared him for. Sometimes following orders was less important than saving lives. In one fluid motion, he stepped out from behind a stone pillar and drew the concealed pistol from beneath his tunic. His first shot took down al-Rashid's companion before the man could finish arming his device. His second shot wounded al-Rashid in the shoulder, spinning him around and preventing him from reaching his own weapon. The square erupted in chaos as people screamed and ran for cover. But Marcus was already moving, covering the distance to the wounded terrorist in seconds. Years of close-quarters combat training took over as he secured both men and rendered their explosive devices safe. Within minutes, the area was swarming with counter-terrorism officers and bomb disposal experts. The immediate threat was over, but Marcus knew that the real work was just beginning. Intelligence teams would spend weeks analyzing the terrorists' plans and tracking down their support network. As the excitement died down and the area was secured, Marcus found himself face-to-face with Sarah Henderson from the Cabinet Office. "Excellent work, Marcus," she said quietly. "Your quick thinking probably saved hundreds of lives today." "Just doing my job, ma'am," Marcus replied, but he couldn't hide the satisfaction in his voice. After months of uncertainty and soul-searching, he had found his purpose again. Later that evening, as he stood guard outside Buckingham Palace in his traditional red tunic, Marcus reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. He had come to the palace seeking peace and anonymity, but instead had found a new way to serve his country and protect the people he had sworn to defend. The other guards still didn't know the full truth about what had happened in Edinburgh, but word had spread that Marcus had been involved in stopping a terrorist attack. The respect in their eyes was genuine now, based not on shooting range performances but on real courage under pressure. Sergeant Major Collins approached him during the evening change of guard. "I hear you had an interesting day in Scotland," Collins said with a slight smile. "Interesting is one way to put it, Sergeant Major," Marcus replied. "Well, for what it's worth, I'm glad you're on our side. Men like you remind me why I'm proud to wear this uniform." As Collins walked away, Marcus resumed his position and gazed out at the quiet London street. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new threats, but tonight he was content to stand guard in the traditional way, knowing that when the time came, he would be ready to do whatever was necessary to protect the crown and the people it represented. The quiet palace guard with the mysterious past had finally found his place in the world, and both his old life and his new one had come together in service of something greater than himself.